I can still remember the way the morning light used to filter through the tall pines at Fort Benning, casting long shadows across the parade grounds. The air there always carried a hint of earth and sweat, a constant reminder of the hard training that defined our lives. On those mornings, with the world quiet and still, it was easy to forget the strange and terrible things I had seen. It was a calm that belied the chaos that was always lurking just beneath the surface of my life. A calm I now realize was the last breath before the storm. My thoughts often drift back to the time I spent in Ranger School, particularly to the day Tom almost died. He was just a kid, fresh out of basic training, eager to prove himself. I remember watching him struggle with his gear one morning, fumbling with his pack in a way that told me he hadn't slept a wink the night before. We were all exhausted, of course, but something about Tom's eyes that day, wide, unblinking, full of a fear he couldn't quite name, stuck with me. Then, in a moment of clumsiness, his hand slipped, and his folding knife stabbed deep into his thigh. The blood came fast, soaking his fatigues, and for a few long minutes, I thought we were going to lose him right there in the dirt. It wasn't just the sight of blood that haunted me, though I've seen more than my fair share of it. It was the way death always seemed to hover at the edges of our lives, even in the most mundane moments. Tom's accident was a reminder that no matter how well trained we were, no matter how much we prepared, the line between life and death was always thin. That line has been my constant companion, but I've never felt it as acutely as I did when the fog began to spread. The first reports of the fog were almost laughable. Strange weather patterns, people said, nothing more than thick mist. But as the days passed and the news grew more dire, laughter turned to unease. Entire cities were disappearing into the fog, communications lost as if they'd been swallowed by the earth itself. At Fort Benning, we tried to maintain our routines, clinging to the familiar rhythms of military life. But underneath it all, there was a sense of dread we couldn't shake, a feeling that something was coming, something none of us were prepared for. I'll never forget the call from my wife. Her voice was strained, barely holding back the panic. "Alex, it's here," she said, and for a moment, I didn't understand. The fog, it's outside the house. The girls, they're scared, Alex. What do we do? I wanted to tell her it would be okay, that it was just a freak weather event, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I told her to stay inside, to keep the doors locked, and to wait for me. But even as I spoke, I knew I might never make it back to them. The fog moved like a living thing, unpredictable and unstoppable. It spread across the world with a malevolent purpose, swallowing cities and towns, turning day into night. At the base, the unease turned to outright fear as we watched the fog creep closer. Communication with the outside world was becoming impossible, the lines crackling with static or going dead altogether. The higher-ups issued orders, but it was clear they were as clueless as the rest of us. The fog was unlike anything we had ever encountered, and we had no idea how to fight it. As the fog closed in, I was given new orders. We were to deploy to Birmingham, a city already lost to the mist, where our mission was to secure the area and provide support to any survivors. It was a suicide mission, and we all knew it. The men under my command were young, many of them still green, barely out of training. Their fear was palpable, and I could see it mirrored in their eyes as they looked to me for reassurance I couldn't provide. I did my best to keep them focused, but inside, I was struggling with the same sense of hopelessness. My thoughts kept drifting back to my wife and daughters. Were they safe? Had the fog reached them yet? The not knowing was the worst part, a slow gnawing at the edges of my mind. But there was no time to dwell on it. We had a mission, and I had men depending on me to lead them into hell. I packed my gear with hands that felt detached, as if I were watching myself from a distance. The fog had already taken so much, and I feared it would take everything before it was done. As we prepared to board the transport plane, I met the pilot, an Air Force major who had seen more than her share of combat. But there was something different in her eyes, a deep, almost primal fear that I hadn't seen in anyone else. "You ever seen anything like this?" she asked, her voice trembling just enough for me to notice. I shook my head, because what could I say? This wasn't a war we were used to fighting. This was something else entirely. As we strapped in, I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. The calm before the storm was over. The fog was here, and we were flying straight into it. The plane lifted off, and I looked around at the faces of the men who would follow me into that mist. In their eyes, I saw the same fear, the same uncertainty that I felt, but there was no turning back now. We were soldiers, and soldiers follow orders, no matter how impossible they might seem. As the ground disappeared beneath us, swallowed by the fog, I closed my eyes and thought of my wife and daughters. I prayed that somehow they would survive this, that we all would. But deep down, I knew the truth. The fog had already taken them, just as it would take us all. The plane's interior was bathed in a dull red light, the kind that always made everything seem more ominous than it was. But this time, the fear wasn't just in the lighting. It was in the air itself. The soldiers around me, young and scared, tried to hide it, but I could see the tension in the way they gripped their rifles, the nervous glances they exchanged when they thought no one was watching. I knew I had to be the rock they could rely on, but the truth was, I was just as scared as they were, maybe more. The mission brief had been vague, even by military standards. Secure the area, assess the situation, assist any survivors. Those were the orders, but we all knew there was little chance of finding anyone alive in Birmingham. The city had been swallowed by the fog days ago, and since then, nothing had come out. Communications were dead. Satellite images showed nothing but a solid wall of gray, and every attempt to reach the city had ended in silence. But we were soldiers, and soldiers follow orders, even when they don't make sense. As we neared the drop zone, the tension in the plane ratcheted up a notch. The fog outside was impenetrable, a thick, roiling mass that seemed to absorb all light. It felt like we were flying into the maw of some great beast, one that could swallow us whole without leaving a trace. I moved down the line, checking on each of my men, offering words of encouragement that felt hollow even as I spoke them. They looked to me with a mixture of fear and hope, hoping that I had some secret plan to get us out of this alive. I didn't. The jump light turned green, and there was no more time to think, no time to second guess. I took a deep breath, steeled myself, and leaped out into the abyss. The air was cold, colder than it should have been, and the fog swallowed me instantly. It was like falling into water, the mist clinging to my skin, my gear muffling all sound. For a few terrifying moments, I couldn't tell which way was up, couldn't see anything but the swirling gray that enveloped me. As I fell, I could hear the faint sounds of my men shouting, their voices distorted and distant, as if they were underwater. Then something else, a high-pitched scream, inhuman and terrifying, that cut through the fog like a knife. I scanned the air around me, trying to spot the source, but there was nothing to see, just endless gray. The scream came again, closer this time, and I realized with a jolt of horror that it wasn't just one scream. It was many, a chorus of voices crying out in agony. The ground rushed up to meet me faster than I expected, and I hit hard, the impact jarring every bone in my body. I struggled to my feet, my legs unsteady beneath me, and looked around. The fog was thick, so thick that I could barely see a few feet in front of me. Shapes moved in the mist, shifting shadows that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. My radio crackled with static, the voices of my men breaking through in fragments, but I couldn't make out any words. We were scattered, separated by the fog, and whatever else was out there. I took a few cautious steps forward, my rifle at the ready. The ground was soft and uneven, the kind of earth that shouldn't be in a city. It took me a moment to realize where I was, a graveyard. The fog parted just enough for me to see the rows of headstones stretching out in all directions, the names on them blurred and unreadable. The air was thick with the smell of decay, a sickly sweet odor that made my stomach turn. I heard a rustling behind me and spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. Out of the fog came a figure, shambling towards me with an unnatural gait. At first, I thought it was one of my men, injured or disoriented, but as it came closer, I saw that it was something else entirely. The skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were empty sockets, dark and hollow. Its mouth hung open, a silent scream frozen on its face. It was a corpse, animated by some unnatural force, moving towards me with a single-minded purpose. I raised my rifle and fired, the shots echoing in the silence. But it didn't stop. It kept coming, relentless, driven by something I couldn't understand. I backed away, my mind racing, trying to process what I was seeing. This wasn't possible, wasn't real, and yet here it was, closing in on me. I fired again, and this time the shots hit something vital. The creature staggered, then crumpled to the ground, its body twitching before going still. But there was no time to celebrate, no time to think. More figures were emerging from the fog, their shapes flickering in and out of view, and I knew that I couldn't fight them all. I turned and ran, my boots slipping on the soft ground, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I needed to find cover, somewhere to regroup and figure out what the hell was going on. Ahead, through the swirling mist, I saw a large stone building, a mausoleum, looming out of the fog like a beacon. I sprinted towards it, my heart pounding in my chest, the sounds of the undead following close behind. The door was heavy, but I threw my weight against it, forcing it open just enough to slip inside. I slammed it shut behind me, the thud echoing in the dark space, and leaned against it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The inside of the mausoleum was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the fog seeping through the cracks in the door. The air was cold, colder than it should have been, and the silence was absolute. I could hear the sounds of the undead outside, their hands scratching at the stone. But for the moment, I was safe. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart, and began to assess my situation. My men were out there, somewhere in the fog, facing the same horrors I had just escaped. I needed to find them, needed to get us out of here, but I knew that wouldn't be easy. The fog was more than just a natural phenomenon. It was alive, malevolent, and it wanted us all dead. I moved deeper into the mausoleum, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The walls were lined with old, crumbling tombs, the names on them worn away by time. As I passed each one, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was lurking just out of sight. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and I had to fight the urge to gag. I knew I couldn't stay here long. The mausoleum might be safe for the moment, but the fog would find a way in eventually. I needed to keep moving, needed to find my men and get us the hell out of Birmingham. But as I reached the far end of the mausoleum, I heard something that made me stop in my tracks. A faint rustling, like the sound of dry leaves being blown across the ground. I turned, my flashlight beam sweeping the room, and saw it, a tomb that had been disturbed, its lid pushed aside just enough for something to slip out. My blood ran cold as I realized what that meant. Whatever had been in that tomb was now out, somewhere in the darkness with me. I took a step back, my rifle trained on the open tomb, my heart pounding in my chest. The rustling grew louder, closer, and I knew I had to move, had to get out of there before whatever was in the mausoleum found me. But even as I turned to leave, I heard it, a low, guttural growl, echoing from the shadows. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The growl came again, closer this time, and I knew that whatever was in the darkness, it wasn't human. The darkness in the mausoleum was oppressive, closing in around me like a shroud. My breath echoed in the stone chamber, the sound of it too loud, too fast. That low growl reverberated off the walls, sending a chill down my spine. Whatever had crawled out of that tomb was close, its presence heavy in the air. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint its location, but the fog and shadows played tricks on my senses, distorting everything. I couldn't stay there. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to find another way out before whatever was lurking in the darkness decided to attack. But as I turned to leave, the growl shifted into something worse. A dry, rasping breath, like air being sucked through a throat that hadn't drawn breath in centuries. The sound grew louder, accompanied by a shuffling that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I swung the beam of my flashlight toward the noise, the light cutting through the fog just enough to reveal the source. There it was, standing at the far end of the mausoleum, its skeletal form barely visible in the dim light. It wasn't just a corpse reanimated by the fog. This thing was something else entirely, something ancient and wrong. Its eyes, or what was left of them, glowed faintly in the darkness, two pinpricks of cold light that bored into me. The creature's mouth hung open, revealing jagged teeth that looked more like broken shards of bone than anything that belonged in a human skull. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a countdown to my next move. I had faced death before, had stared it down in the heat of battle. But this was different. This was something that should not exist, something pulled from nightmares and thrust into the waking world. I raised my rifle, hands shaking, and squeezed the trigger. The muzzle flash lit up the mausoleum for an instant, the deafening crack of the shot echoing through the chamber. The bullet struck home, hitting the creature square in the chest, but it didn't go down. The creature staggered, but instead of collapsing, it lunged at me, faster than anything that should have been able to move on those brittle legs. I barely had time to react, throwing myself to the side as it swiped at me with claw-like fingers. The tips of its claws grazed my arm, tearing through the fabric of my sleeve and drawing blood. The pain was sharp, but adrenaline dulled it, my focus narrowing to one goal: survival. I scrambled to my feet, the rifle still in my grip, and fired again, this time aiming for its head. The shot connected, and the creature's skull shattered with a sickening crunch, sending shards of bone and rotten flesh flying. It collapsed to the ground, its body twitching before going still. The stench of decay was overwhelming, filling the air with a putrid odor that made my stomach churn. I took a step back, my heart still racing, and tried to catch my breath. The silence that followed was almost worse than the battle. The fog seemed to press in on me, the shadows closing ranks now that the immediate threat was gone. I knew I couldn't stay in the mausoleum. Whatever that thing was, there could be more of them, and I had no desire to find out if I could survive another encounter. But as I turned to leave, something else caught my eye, something that made my blood run cold. On the floor, just beyond the shattered remains of the creature, lay a discarded uniform, the name patch still visible under a layer of dust and grime. It was one of ours, standard issue, the same as the one I was wearing. The sight of it sent a jolt of fear through me, the implications settling like a lead weight in my gut. This wasn't just any uniform. It belonged to one of my men. Whoever had worn it was either dead or had become something much worse, and the thought of facing that possibility filled me with a dread I hadn't felt since I was a young soldier, fresh out of basic training. I couldn't dwell on it. I forced myself to focus, to push the fear aside, and think rationally. I had to get out of the mausoleum, find my remaining men, and figure out what the hell was going on in this cursed place. But as I moved toward the exit, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to flicker with movement, every breath of air carrying the promise of something lurking just out of sight. As I reached the heavy stone door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the cold surface. The fog outside was no safer than the darkness within, but staying here wasn't an option. I pushed the door open, the fog spilling in like a living thing, swirling around my feet. I stepped out into the night, the cold air biting at my skin, and took a moment to orient myself. The graveyard stretched out before me, the headstones barely visible in the thick mist. I needed to move, to find my men and get us all the hell out of Birmingham before the fog claimed us too. But even as I began to move, a thought struck me. What if my men were already gone? What if the fog had taken them, twisted them into the same monstrosities that I had just faced in the mausoleum? The thought was almost too much to bear, a heavy weight that threatened to drag me down into despair. I shook it off, forcing myself to focus on the task at hand. They were still out there, and until I had proof otherwise, I would keep fighting to bring them home. I moved through the graveyard, the fog swallowing my footsteps, muffling every sound. The world felt smaller, closed in by the mist, the darkness pressing down from all sides. Every rustle of the wind, every creak of a tree branch, set my nerves on edge. My senses stretched to the breaking point. I was alone in this haunted place, but I couldn't afford to be paralyzed by fear. My men were counting on me, and I wasn't about to let them down. As I walked, I thought of my wife and daughters again, their faces clear in my mind's eye. The thought of them gave me strength, a reminder of what I was fighting for. I had to survive this, for them, for my men, for everyone who was counting on me to make it out of this nightmare alive. The fog was a living thing, a force of malevolence that wanted to break me, but I wasn't going to give it that satisfaction. I pushed forward, each step a battle against the fear that threatened to consume me. The fog was thick, the world around me reduced to a small circle of visibility, but I kept moving, driven by a determination I hadn't felt in a long time. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about fighting back, about refusing to be another victim of the fog's twisted game. And as long as I had breath in my body, I would keep fighting, no matter what horrors lay ahead. The silence in the graveyard was suffocating, more oppressive than the fog itself. It pressed down on me, wrapping around my thoughts like a vice, making it harder to think, harder to breathe. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the fog was sapping my strength with every passing moment. I could feel its malevolent presence, like a cold breath on the back of my neck, whispering doubts and fears into my ear. But I pushed forward, refusing to give in to the despair that threatened to overwhelm me. I'd always prided myself on being able to stay calm under pressure, to keep my head when others were losing theirs. But this was different. This wasn't a battlefield where the enemy was flesh and blood, where you could see who or what you were fighting. The fog was something else entirely, an enemy without form, without reason. It was everywhere and nowhere at once, and it fed on fear, growing stronger the more you let it in. I had to keep moving, had to stay focused, or I knew it would consume me. As I navigated the fog-shrouded graveyard, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and every rustle of the wind, every creak of a tree branch, sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I scanned the area constantly, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow. But there was nothing to see, just the endless gray, shifting and swirling around me like a living thing. The fog seemed to close in tighter with each passing minute, the world shrinking until it felt like I was walking in a dream, disconnected from reality. The mausoleum loomed behind me, a dark silhouette against the fog. It was a place of the dead, a tomb for those who had passed long before this nightmare began. But now it had become a refuge of sorts, a last bastion against the horrors lurking outside. I had escaped it once, but now I wondered if I had made a mistake in leaving. Out here in the open, there was nowhere to hide, nowhere to take cover if the fog decided to show me more of its nightmares. I paused for a moment, trying to get my bearings, but the fog was disorienting, twisting the landscape into something unrecognizable. Every direction looked the same, just more headstones, more shadows, more uncertainty. I thought of the men I was supposed to be leading, scattered somewhere in this godforsaken place, and felt a pang of guilt. I was their commander, responsible for their lives, but I was as lost as they were. The thought weighed heavily on me, gnawing at the edges of my resolve. The fog was playing tricks on my mind, distorting reality until I couldn't trust my own senses. I swore I heard voices, distant and faint, calling out from somewhere in the mist. At first, I thought it was my men, trying to find their way back to me. But as I listened closer, I realized the voices weren't right. They were twisted, unnatural, full of a mocking tone that sent a shiver down my spine. They weren't calling for help. They were calling to me, beckoning me to give in, to surrender to the fog. I clenched my fists, digging my nails into my palms to ground myself, to remind myself that I was still here, still alive. I couldn't let the fog win. I couldn't let it break me. I had to stay strong, had to keep moving, no matter how hopeless it seemed. But the voices grew louder, more insistent, filling my head with doubts and fears. They whispered of my failures, of the men I had lost, of the family I would never see again. They told me it was all pointless, that there was no escape, that the fog would claim me just as it had claimed everyone else. I stumbled forward, each step a battle against the rising tide of despair. The fog thickened, the voices growing louder, more frantic, as if they knew I was trying to resist. They wanted me to give up, to lay down my weapon and accept my fate. But I wasn't ready to do that. Not yet. I still had something to fight for, even if it was just the slim hope that I might find my men, that we might somehow survive this nightmare. The silence that followed the voices was almost worse than the noise. It was as if the fog itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do next. The weight of it was crushing, a physical presence that pressed down on me from all sides. I could feel it in my bones, in my blood, like a sickness that was spreading through my body, sapping my strength, my will to fight. But I kept moving, kept pushing forward, because stopping meant giving in, and giving in meant death, or worse. I don't know how long I wandered through that fog, time losing all meaning as the world around me blurred into a gray haze. It felt like hours, days even, though it could have been only minutes. My thoughts grew sluggish, my movements mechanical, as if I were sleepwalking through a nightmare. The fog had wrapped itself around my mind, dulling my senses, making it harder to think, harder to remember why I was fighting in the first place. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a flicker of movement, a shadow among the shadows, too fast to be a trick of the light. My heart leaped in my chest, a surge of adrenaline cutting through the fog-induced lethargy. I turned toward the movement, my grip tightening on my rifle, and strained to see through the mist. The shadow was gone, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. Something was out there, something real, something alive. I took a step toward the spot where the shadow had been, every nerve in my body on high alert. The fog seemed to pulse around me, as if reacting to my movements, the air growing colder, denser. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the blood rushing in my ears as I inched forward, ready for whatever came next. The fog had shown me its worst, had tried to break me with its twisted visions, but I was still here, still fighting. And as long as I had breath in my body, I would keep fighting, no matter what horrors lay ahead. I stepped into the unknown, my rifle at the ready, the fog closing in behind me like a curtain. Whatever was out there, I would face it head on. I had no other choice.